So my name's Alex and I'm a PhD student researching intoxication and sexual consent, which, as we've already discussed, is a really tricky, complex area. I think, there's a lot of diverse opinion on whether people can consent when they're intoxicated, or, whether sex and drugs can ever combine in a way that's positive. But I guess why I'm really interested in doing this research is that people do, can and do have sex while they're intoxicated. And a lot of the sex that they have, they would reflect on as being consensual. And I think it's important to kind of respect that and try and understand how it works. But equally, it's important to remember that intoxication and sexual consent and issues around sexual assault, like, those are present too. So yes, there are good things, but there are also potential negatives. So it's just, providing a balance between the two and working out how we might best avoid the negatives and kind of emphasize the positives. But yeah, so I've got some, points for reflection for if you're going to be combining sex and intoxication, whether it be alcohol or other drugs. Just some things to think about. If, are you happy? Is the other person happy? That kind of thing. But yeah, so firstly, I guess it's really important to think about your own mindset. Obviously, when you take drugs, you feel differently about certain things. Maybe you lose your inhibitions. Maybe you want to do things that you wouldn't necessarily want to do while sober, that kind of thing. So those kind of things can translate to sex too. So it's important to consider. A lot of time when I was conducting interviews with people who combine sex and drugs, something that kind of came out of it a lot is, before combining a certain drug with sex, like, have you had experience with that drug before? Do you know the way it makes you feel? Do you know what kind of doses you should be taking? Do you know where your limits are? So, that's something to consider. If you're going to use a drug with sex, do you know, how you respond to that drug? Do you feel comfortable with it? That kind of thing. Other questions to ask yourself, quite basic ones, but really important ones, do you feel safe where you are? Do you feel comfortable with what you're doing? Because it is okay to back out of a situation. You don't have to go through with things that you've started. Remember, consent is a process, and just because you've agreed to something at the beginning doesn't mean you have to go through with it. You can withdraw at any time. And other things to think about is, do people know where you are? Do you have friends nearby? Do they know what you're doing? Another thing you could think about is, have you done something like this before? Have you had sex on this drug before? And how have you felt afterwards? Have you regretted it? Have you enjoyed it? Just reflections, things to consider. So yeah, your own mindset being one really important thing. Kind of following on from that, the second thing would be the person you're having sex with, their mindset. Are they on drugs too? How might that be making them feel? Would it make them feel differently? Are you on the same drug? People often talk about MDMA, for example, as really enhancing emotional connections between people. How does that translate to sex? Maybe the drugs that you're on could make you talk more. Maybe you could have more conversations about the kind of sex that you want to have. And if you're not having conversations, maybe it's a good idea to. We know that consent can be verbal, but it can also be non-verbal. Maybe you're having sex with a long-term partner, and if you're doing that, then maybe you kind of know what they're okay with and what they're not okay with, and maybe non-verbal consent is something that could work in that particular context. But is non-verbal consent going to hold up in all contexts? Maybe asking is a good idea, something to reflect on as well. So yeah, considering those two things brings to a third thing, which is how can you go about having that conversation? And this is a really difficult thing. I don't really know what to say here.
So the first thing was what? The first thing was mindset.
Mindset.
Second thing was person.
Other person's mindset.
And the third one is how to have this conversation.
Yeah.
So do you think it's even a conversation? Because we talked about a lot of sexuality is clearly nonverbal.
I mean, as I said, it doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying consent has to look like this in each circumstance, because, saying only a clear verbal yes means consent while it's well-intentioned, it's not going to resonate with everyone. It's not going to be everyone's experience of having sex. So I'm not going to sit here and say, you know, this is how the conversation should go. You should be asking and you should be doing this, because, you know, it really is context dependent. Have you had a prior relationship with that person? Do you know what they like sexually? Do you know what they feel comfortable with? Do you know what they don't like? Or if you don't know those things, then maybe that is a good time to have the conversation. Maybe that is a good time to, you know, start slow, check in. Was this okay? Was this not okay? Do you feel comfortable with this? Do you feel happy? And as you're checking in with other people, checking in with yourself too. That's important. Like, you know, there's 2 people or maybe 3, 4, 5 people having sex. However many people are having sex, you know, how are you feeling? How are they feeling? It's everyone involved. So it's placing value on the experiences of everybody in the situation, not just yourself. So yeah, I mean, again, thinking of it not as a one-time, like, yeah, this is cool, this is all good, a continuous checking in. And yeah, maybe sometimes that could look something like, oh, are you enjoying this? Like, is this all good? Can I do this? Or maybe it's just, you know, a noise, or just, you know, eye contact or things like that. It's not going to look the same all the time, but it's something to think about. Like, how do you know the person that you're having sex with is enjoying it and happy? Like, just ask yourself that. How do you know normally? And, you know, can you translate that to new situations? That kind of thing.
What's next? So that was mindset, person, conversation.
I guess maybe setting. Yeah.
Let's talk about setting.
Yeah, so I guess another thing to consider is where, you know, where are you when you're having sex? Is it just 2 people alone in a house, in a room? Are you at a party where there are other people? Are you in a club? So, like, some places are already associated with certain rules about what is and what is not okay. So, you know, in some places, maybe certain clubs, verbal consent is really encouraged, and people are like, yeah, you need to ask someone if you want to go up to them, if you want to touch them, if you want to kiss them. You need to ask at every stage. And so in that case, you know, it's about respecting where you are, respecting the rules of the place, and kind of following on with the culture there. But then if you're in your own house, just with one other person, what does consent look like there when there's no, you know, official rules of how it should go? So again, that's going back to, what should it look like for you? What's best with the 2 people who are involved? So personally, I would never hold a victim of sexual assault responsible for what happened to them. And I think there's a lot of problems that are going to happen if you begin to do that. I think already, in terms of like sexual assault prevention, you know, rape prevention, the emphasis is usually placed on policing the victim's behavior. Like, what can you do to avoid sexual assault? But given that a lot of these tips that we are given, like don't go out alone at night and stuff like that, are kind of, you know, they don't really hold up, given that most sexual assaults happen in private houses and things like that. How much can you police your behavior? Like, how much responsibility can you put on someone who can't, you know, there's little they can do in a lot of ways to avoid those kinds of things. So yeah, responsibility is a tough one. I mean, I have like, in my qualitative interviewing, I've come across 2 men who, in their interviews, described sex that I would class as them sexually assaulting someone, but they absolutely didn't. And for me, that's what really leads me to believe that a lot of these cases they're not gonna consider to be sexual assault.
What factors led you to believe? Because obviously you crossed a certain line where in your mind you said this is sexual assault. Do you remember some of those factors that led you to say, all right, this is too far?
Yeah, there was, so one of the guys that really stands out in particular, the first thing he said, which made me think it was sexual assault, but he immediately was like, I'm joking. He said, oh yeah, I literally raped her. And I was like, what? And he was like, oh, not really, because she liked it. So that put me on edge immediately. But he basically described, I'm just going to be really explicit and graphic here, like choking her and fisting her with like no communication prior to that. No, like, you know, is this something that's going to be okay with you? Can I do this now? just the description, it was so graphic and like brutal. He was just like, oh yeah, like I fucked her so hard, and like she was so fucked up. She like told me, because they were stoned and drunk, and you know, alcohol and cannabis being the main ones. He was like, she told me all about her life. It was so fucked up. There was like a big age gap between them, and he found her really unattractive. He'd met her on Tinder and just wanted to hook up for that night. And the way he spoke about her, it was like she wasn't even a person. You know what I mean? It was just like, I got stoned and drunk enough so I could get in the mood to have sex, and then I just absolutely obliterated her, which was basically how he described it. And no debrief afterwards, no like, you know, are you okay? Is this all good? Did you enjoy that? Nothing about her enjoyment. It was just all about him. And in his description of the encounter, I could see no evidence that he at any point considered her well-being or enjoyment. And I think, you know, that's where like ethical sex really comes in. Are you placing value on the experience of the other person? For me, I could see no evidence that he was placing value on her experience at all. Like nothing.
And so I think what would be interesting too is, I don't know if there's any debate on this, but how do we separate? Because like I hear the story and it's like, clearly this dude is a monster. Clearly this man is an absolute monster. You know,
but he wasn't though. That's the thing. He's a normal dude. Like he's not a monster. Like he's just a normal dude. He's describing to me a female researcher sex that he had that he thinks is fine.
Maybe he's a normal dude on the outside, but I would say that's very.
Well, I mean, it's a question. Like, I know another woman who's doing a PhD on like representations of sex offenders and how we're very quick to cast them as the other because we don't want to think of them as a normal person because it's upsetting, right?
Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of where my question was going to tie in. So I would say somebody like that, I consider, let's just for now put them in like the category of extreme. Like that's leaning towards the worst case. No remorse, very proud of the details and things like that. But is that strata, that group, that guy, does he represent the majority, or is it a situation where the majority of people, it's oh yeah, I guess in hindsight that it was sexual assault, and at the time I didn't feel that it was. You know, are these people really these vicious, don't give a fuck monsters? Is it more often than not? You get the question that I'm asking?
Yes.
Do we have any way to stratify what a normal rapist looks like?
I guess I would counter that question with another question, which is how much of the sex that he was having, this one specific person, how much of the sex looked like that? And I would say that was only one instance in which I thought he committed an assault. The other sex that he had, he demonstrated complete ability to care about the other person's well-being with women that he found attractive, or women that he wanted to date, or women that weren't significantly older than him. Like he had the capacity and ability to care about someone else having sex. Like he described sex with another woman where he checked in and said, you know, did you have an orgasm? And she said no. And he was like, oh, like I wish you told me. Like I want to know how to make you come. I want to know how to make sex good for you. So contrast that with this experience of a woman he was absolutely not attracted to and didn't give a shit about. It's like an interesting thing for me because it's not like every bit of sex he's having is assault. It's I don't know, it's really complex. And yeah, I can't completely class him as this like terrible, inhumane person. I mean, I can to an extent, but it's not the whole picture of him as a person. It's just a tiny snapshot. And if we just considered that, then yeah, you could be like, he's a terrible rapist, but he's also a rounded person who's had different sexual experiences too.
Cool. So this is complex.
Yes. Yeah, it's absolutely a really, really complex issue, and one that we don't have enough conversations about in general. So I think the Global Drug Survey has done a good job in just beginning to start to talk about intoxication and sexual consent. Opened up some avenues where we might question ourselves and where we might reflect on our behaviour, and also, you know, counteract rape myths a lot as well. Who, you know, where is these things happening? What kind of advice can we give to people? That kind of thing. But yeah, the main takeaway is that people's lived experience of sexual assault is complex. People have feelings of responsibility. People have, you know, they have a difficult time defining it as a crime, defining it as assault. We have a picture of what sexual assault is, and one that doesn't necessarily fit people's lived experience. So I think that's what makes it really challenging. But it's absolutely something that we can talk about and can change in a positive way.